Paper was like gold in medieval times.
Oh, not tobacco. Sugar.
That everything we thought we knew about the world might turn out to be completely wrong.
Deserts, the driest places on Earth, covering more than a fifth of all the world's landmass, as dangerous to life as the highest peak or the coldest glacier. But in these harsh and barren wastelands, nature endures. People have lived in the desert since the beginning of time. Resilient and resourceful, they have developed unique cultures and deep spiritual bonds with these arid lands. But the modern world of commerce and industry is encroaching on the desert, claiming its resources, changing the delicate balance of life. Now, more than ever, desert people must adapt to survive. This series tells their story of struggle and endeavor, of humanity's continuing relationship with the most challenging places on Earth. Jerusalem, a city built at the very edge of the desert. One of the holiest places on earth, sacred to three faiths. For Jews, Jerusalem is the center of their promised land and of their world. It's where Solomon's temple stood and Herod's temple after it, and where one day many Jews believe a third temple may stand. Jerusalem is also sacred to Muslims. It's from here Muslims believe that Muhammad ascended to heaven. And for Christians, Jerusalem is central to the key events which gave birth to their faith. It's the city where Jesus was tried and crucified and died, and where he rose again. From all over the world, Christians come here to follow their Lord's last journey to his place of execution. On high days and religious holidays, the streets of the old city are a crush of pilgrims seeking to worship and celebrate. But in all the push and shove, it isn't easy to get close to God. That's why so many pilgrimages here also include time spent in the wilderness, which lies just outside the city's walls. The Judean Desert, the desert of the soul. The spiritual significance of the desert is deep and ancient. It runs through all three faiths. For Muslims, the desert is hot, dry, infertile, the very opposite of the perpetual gardens of paradise. Jewish prophets look forward to the desert blooming, to streams in the wilderness. And before beginning his ministry, Jesus himself withdrew to this desert, to solitude and quiet contemplation, to nothing but the absolute essentials of life. Over the centuries, many followed Christ's example. In the cliffs and crannies of the Judean desert, monasteries housed those who felt called to renounce the world, to live as far from luxury and distraction as humans can. Even simpler, even more solitary, were the rock caves that became hermits' cells. Today, pilgrims arrive here by the coachload, but their quest is much the same, to reconnect with what really matters.
መጽሐፍ ቅዱስ እንዳነበብ ነው አሁን ደግሞ በአይናችን እያየው ስለሆን በጣም ትልቅ ደስታ ነው።
Ruth Sayon is one of a group of Ethiopian Christians who've come today to Qasr al-Yahud, a desert location traditionally regarded as the place where Jesus' ministry began. In Sunday school, Ruth will have learned that Jesus was baptized in the River Jordan immediately before he went into the desert to fast and pray, and to be tempted by the devil. Many Christians believe that this is where the baptism happened. The Bible says that when Jesus rose up from the river, the heavens opened and the Spirit of God came down like a dove, saying, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased." From all over the world, Christians come to be baptized in these same desert waters. Miyaza Yohannes is another of the Ethiopian Christians here today. She's leading the group of pilgrims who've come to follow Jesus' example.
መጠመቅ ማለት ክርስቶስ ኢየሱስ በዮርዳኖስ ባህር ገብቶ እንደተጠመቀና መንፈስ ቅዱስ በኢየሱስ ላይ እንደወረደና ለስራ እንዳሰራው ዛሬም መጠመቅ ማለት ለኛ እዛ ሄደን የኢየሱስ ክርስቶስን ስራ እንድንሰራ ፍጹም ሙላት እንዲኖረን መንፈስ ቅዱስ በኃይል እንዲወርድ ነው። ይሄ ነው ትርጉሙ። አዎ የህይወት መለወጥ ነው ለኔ። ምክንያቱም ይሄንን ነው ማምነው የህይወት መለወጥ ነው።
ኢየሱስ ለዘላለም ጌታ ነው። አሜን። ኢየሱስ ለዘላለም ጌታ ነው።
As the day goes on, more and more pilgrims arrive, keen to experience baptism. The peace and quiet of the desert have melted away. Spiritual fervor is all around instead. But Qasr al-Yahud isn't just a place of religious significance. The river marks the dividing line between two countries, Israel and Jordan. From the far bank, Jordanian soldiers keep a watchful eye. Here, this desert of the soul is also a military zone. All around the baptism site, the signs of past conflict are plain to see. Located at the center of one of the world's religious flashpoints, Qasr al-Yahud has only recently been reopened to pilgrims. Work to build new facilities for them is ongoing, in what is essentially still a militarized zone. Security remains a real worry for the Israeli authorities. But as veteran tour guide Dikram Torassian knows, there's an economic imperative to make sure the desert remains open for business.
Now we dance. We dance the Ethiopian dance with the shoulders. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
הצליינות הנוצרי הייתה הבסיס של התיירות הישראלית. תמיד היה ותמיד יהיה. רוב התיירים שבאים לארץ הם צליינים. הפתיחה של האתר של קיסר היהוד, כמובן זה יעודד צליינות לארץ, ואני חושב הסיבה היחידה שמדינת ישראל החליטה לפתוח את האזור הצבאי זה שהירדנים שיפרו ופתחו את האזור שלהם, שזה ידוע בתור בריטניה של הירדן.
Touring the Judean desert is one of the real highlights of a visit to the Holy Land. Crossing the wilderness is a network of modern highways which speed the tour buses with little delay from one ancient religious site to the next. But even pilgrims have to eat. A lunch stop is a chance for the Ethiopians to draw breath and reflect on the spiritual sustenance they've gained. Almaz Zabiya Yosef, a mother of 15 children, is in her 80s, and she experiences this desert journey in a special way. She's blind.
የመጣሁት እግዚአብሔር የተቀበረበትን ላመሰግነው የሰጠኝን ፍሬዎቼን በጸጋ ስላሳደገልኝ ሳይታመሙ ሆስፒታል ሳይሆኑ እዚህ ያደረሰልኝን አምላክ ላመሰግነው። አሁንም እግዚአብሔር ብርሃኔን ይሰጠኛል ብዬ ሁልጊዜ ሰዎች ሲጠይቁኝ ከእግዚአብሔር ተስፋዬን አልቆርጥም። አሁንም ታምሩን ያሳየኛል፣ ያበራኛል።
This afternoon, another mode of transport and another high point for the pilgrims. This cable car on the outskirts of Jericho takes visitors to a desert peak which stands 350 meters above sea level. This is the Mount of Temptation, said to be the very spot where the devil confronted Jesus.
Ladies, thou shalt not be tempted to do jewelry. You're climbing Mount Temptation. So no temptation.
While Christ fasted for 40 days, the devil tempted him to use his supernatural powers for selfish ends. One temptation was to satisfy his hunger by turning the stones of the desert into bread. Early Christian pilgrims searched for the place where Jesus overcame the devil's wiles. It was Queen Helena of Constantinople who, in the year 326, is supposed to have identified this as the location. Ever since, hermits have come to follow Jesus' example and live lives of extreme simplicity in caves on the mountain. In the 6th century, a Greek Orthodox monastery was built over the cave which is thought to have sheltered Christ for 40 nights. A pilgrimage here is meant to be a lesson in what the desert can do for the spirit. But modern tourism can sometimes feel more like a shopping trip. Those who believe that this is where Jesus fasted are now tempted to eat and drink. There's been no miracle cure today for Almaz Zabiya Yosef. Yet for those who have faith, coming away to the wilderness remains a far from empty experience.
And this is natural rock.
እኔ እዛ ስንነከር ብዙዎች ሰዎች እንዳይጠራጠሩ እውነት እንደሆነ ፈውስ እንዳለ ነበረ ማስረዳቸው። ፈውስ አለ እዚህ እና እመኑ እና ከማመን ጋር የተያያዘ ነው። ያቺ እናት ምናልባት ፊዚካሊ አይኗ ላይፈወስ ይችላል፣ ግን ውስጧ ስፒሪቹዋሊ መንፈሷ ሊታደስ ይችላልና ያንን ነው ያመንኩት።
As it always has done, this desert still nourishes the soul. It's also a place which presents physical challenges which many find hard to resist. Dawn above the Dead Sea. Despite temperatures that exceed 40 degrees Celsius, it's a mecca for adventurers looking to scale the cliffs. And where you have climbers, you need rescuers. Today, the Megillot Search and Rescue Team are preparing to plug 2 new volunteers. After weeks of training, this is the first chance for them to see if they're desert ready.
סיימנו קורס הכשרה של חילוץ בחבלים לפני 3 שבועות, וזה האימון הגדול הראשון במסגרת היחידה שאנחנו עושים מאז.
In charge is Mike Ott. As deputy head of the unit, it's his job to set the challenge and monitor the team's performance. From the moment the exercise begins, it's a race against the clock. The experienced volunteers are putting their own lives at risk, testing the rope skills of the rookies. Every knot and every belay has to be perfect. For trainee Yonu Shaina, it's an adrenaline rush.
יש אלמנט של פחד בעבודה, וזה אלמנט חשוב, כי מי שלא מפחד כנראה לא מבין את העבודה שהוא עושה.
For fellow newcomer Karima Oridershtik, there's also a lot to play for. A nurse in real life, today she must navigate a steep descent to reach her patients.
באותו רגע שאת נמצאת בתוך פעילות, חלק הבטיחותי הוא בכלל בצד, אתה עסוק בלהציל חיים.
For Karima, saving lives is a family affair.
והאמת היא שמי שהתחיל ביחידה זה הבן שלי, שהוא היה הראשון שהתחיל להיות ביחידה כשהיה מאוד צעיר, בן 16-17, ואחר כך בעלי התחיל להתנדב, ואז גם אני, ויש פעמים שאנחנו כולנו מתנדבים ביחד בתוך היחידה.
As deserts go, the Judean is small but deadly. Particularly to the thousands of people who venture here unprepared. Part of the problem is that this desert is so easily accessible. City dwellers can get here in a matter of minutes. It leaves them no time to adjust to the environment, as team leader Mike Ott knows only too well.
אני חושב שרוב החילוצים הם נובעים מאנשים שהם פשוט לא מבינים את המדבר. הם לא מבינים, הם לא עושים בדיקה לאן הם הולכים.
Just a week ago, this team worked all night to rescue a group of hikers lost and suffering from exhaustion and dehydration deep in the desert. But it's not just the lack of water people need to be prepared for. Sometimes, and without warning, there's water everywhere. During the springtime flash floods, torrents of rainwater flow from the Judean mountains through the valleys of the desert. The rocky limestone terrain cannot absorb the water, and it collects in deep, fast-flowing gullies. Thrill seekers who come to experience the drama are sometimes caught in the deluge.
והם לא יודעים שצריך לקחת חבלים, הם לא יודעים שהם צריכים לשחות, וכאלה שיוצאים לא יודעים לשחות.
Moti, 3 minutes. 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 3 min
When it comes to saving lives in the desert, Mike knows every second counts. A lesson these new recruits are learning fast. Once they reach their patient, they must act quickly to administer emergency treatment. The sooner they stabilize him, the sooner they can winch him to safety. That is, if the ropes hold. But they mustn't get ahead of themselves. As Mike knows, the most serious injuries happen to those who take the desert for granted.
אם לא נצמדים, לא נתפסים, לא קושרים כמו שצריך, אז אנשים נופלים, וזה הטעויות הגדולות יותר. אלה שהם מטיילים מאוד ותיקים ויודעים לטייל, אבל הם שוכחים שהמדבר גדול עליהם, שהם לא יכולים לעשות מה שהם רוצים, ושגרביטציה עובדת.
Finally, Mike gives the nod. The new volunteers have passed. Now they're fully part of this team and its sacred mission, to be ready to lay down their lives for strangers in distress. But there are some people who instinctively know how to survive in the Judean desert. When the dust storms come, the Bedouin know how to see them out. Since time immemorial, Bedouins have lived in desert conditions like these. Sabha is a Bedouin wife and mother of 9 children. Her family are nomads, Arab shepherds, descendants of the Negev Bedouin, who migrated northwards from the Arabian desert 3 centuries ago. Her life follows a daily pattern that hasn't changed much in all that time. She spends hours shaking this camel skin bag to make yogurt from goat's milk. Yogurt is a food the Bedouins brought north from the Arabian Peninsula, where they've used it as a staple for thousands of years.
اليوم أخذ من الصبح وأسوي لأولادي فطور أفطرهم وبعد الظهر الحين أشتغل في العشاء أسوي أكل أسوي خبز والحين أوجه الغنمات أحلبهن وأحطن فيها المطربانات وأتعلل شوية للساعة 8 وبعدين أحط راسي وأنام. ها وش اللي أسوي وقتها صعب ولا مو صعب عايشين والحمد لله.
But now, their way of life here in Israel is under threat from forces even more powerful than the desert wind. The Bedouins are caught up in the bitter struggle over land between Jews and Palestinians, which overshadows the politics of the Middle East. There's huge pressure on them to move away from areas Israel regards as strategically important, but there's no obvious home for them elsewhere.
شو بدنا نسوي؟ هذه عيشتنا وين نروح؟ وين دلقك؟ ما في وين اروح يعني خلاص اولادي وغنمي وهانها عايشه. يعني وين اروح؟ وين اروح؟ هذه منطقتي عايشه بيها.
The family have to range far and wide to find rough pasture and water for their livestock. Over the winter, this is their base. Just enough shelter beneath a small ridge for themselves and their animals. The name Bedouin means those in the desert. Feared by some for their ferocity, they are a proud people, inheritors of a nomadic way of life that's grown out of harshness and has stood the test of time. But Sabha's husband, Ali, sees all that coming to an end with the current generation.
البدو كان بيكرموا بيضربوا بسيف بيطعموا بشرف بحياة بخجل عندهم ذوق عندهم إنسانية عندهم عزازة نفس اليوم كل العالم ما فيش أنا بخاف.
Even here in the desert, Bedouin families feel the pressure of modern life encroaching on them.
لا ما بيمشوا على ممشانا لأن الحين صار علم وصار مدارس. احنا كنا جاهلية لا قراية ولا علم. زمان أنا ما بقرأ ولا بكتب. أبوي وأمي وكلهم ما يقرأ.
Already, many young Bedouins are part of the Palestinian education system. They learn about the desert in a different way from their mothers and fathers. Today, the shrine of Ne'ebi Musa is welcoming a succession of school visits. In Islamic tradition, this is a significant place of pilgrimage, the grave of Moses, a prophet revered by both Jews and Muslims. But compared with the well-developed sites holy to Jews and Christians, this shrine is starved of funding, according to local leader Abul Qasim.
إن هذا المكان يعني كان دائما للثقافة والتعليم والتربية والإرشاد. المعلمين تخرجوا من هذا المكان، ولكن الآن يعني بصيغة الاحتلال أصبح المكان ليس عنده إمكانية أن يأتي بأي نوع من الطلاب أو يعمل أي معهد تعليمي للمكان.
With more money, they could develop a proper educational center here, one that could really embrace Bedouin children from the hills all around. The real history of this desert is something that's being lost because there's nowhere to pass it on.
ولكن الأمل قريب إنه يكون هذا المكان مهيأ للشباب الذي يعيش حول هذه المنطقة، خاصة شباب البدو، يعني إنه ما زال في بدو يعيشوا كثيرين حول هذه المنطقة وبتغلبوا في سفريات بعيدة للتعليم، والأمل أن يكون هذا المكان مهيأ لهم في المستقبل إن شاء الله، بحيث تصير في دورات تعليمية الحمد لله رب العالمين يكون يخرج يعني المثقفين والعلماء والصالحين من هذا المكان كما كان سابقا.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.
A new day. And for Sabha and her Bedouin family, a change in the weather. Another year has turned. It's time to pack up the winter quarters and move on. They don't need a calendar to tell them this. Knowing when and where to move is a Bedouin instinct developed over millennia of desert life.
لقينا عشان دار الصيف بدنا نبرد فوق شوية يعني هناك دار المشتى وهان دار الصيف نقعد هان 6 أشهر وتحت 6 أشهر بس تفوت الشتوية تخلص نرحل في شهر 5 والحمد لله رب العالمين إننا نبرد هان عشان أبرد للغنم وأبرد للأولاد وأبرد النحلة وأحسن يعني هان شوية من تحت شوبة وحم يطعي حم تحت الحمد لله رب العالمين.
Bedouins still follow their instincts. But these days, their scope for living as true nomads is severely restricted. The Israeli state has deliberately encouraged the Bedouin to settle in towns. Grazing restrictions hem them in. There's pressure on their land from new Jewish settlements. Now, they simply can't sustain themselves without connections to urban life.
جيبها من البلد من الغرب على التراكتر. على التراكتر جيبها من البلد من الغرب. وهذا وش اسمه العلف نجيبها من عند التاجر من تقوع. جايبية لحم الغسيل معنا والمية من تقوع. ياخذ التنك بأسبوع تنك 6 كيل 3 قد وإحنا شربنا وهنا ويست.
The nomadic traditions of the Bedouin, it seems, are fast approaching their end. Schools and shops are shaping their children's desires. But in these lives, a faith persists that the desert is the source of a good life. There's more honor here, they say, than in all the wealth and consumerism of the modern world.
وربنا يجيب مطر وبنحرث وبنحصد ويسووا الغنم تاكل من الشعير والعرب والناس ياكل من القمح. شو بنسوي؟ امر الله بده ينفذ. فاحنا نقول اليوم ما ظل بركه، يعني معك 1000 شيكل بتخش السوق طارق ولا لا؟ بيطير الزمان في بركه وفي خير وفي نعمه الله، وش بنسوي؟
If it's for a blessing that tourists come here, perhaps it's not surprising that they're very happy to spend their shekels on ways to remember it. Jerusalem is full of tourist bazaars, hawking mementos of a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. Modern marketing seems at odds with a religion whose founder threw the money changers out of the temple. But that story only goes to show how ancient the link between selling and faith is. Other shops offer something that's more authentic. Genuine archaeological finds dating back to biblical times. Oil lamps first lit when Jesus was alive. Coins like the widow's mite, worth next to nothing back then, and used by Christ, the Bible says, to illustrate an eternal truth. Poor people giving a little means so much more than the rich donating from their plenty. Now the widow's mite and everything else here is worth a pretty penny. For owner Nidal Ibrahim Omar Hrub, antiques are in his blood.
المحل هذا قبل 50 سنة كان قاعد فيه سيدي، فتحه حوالي 50 سنة، بعديها توفى، قاعد فيه أبوي قبل 10 سنين، فتحوا أنتيكة يعني نفس الشغلة. ما بعد أنا بشتغل مع أبوي نتعلم الصنعة يعني الشغلة هي الأنتيكة.
Stores like these have to be registered with the Department of Antiquities, and the trade is strictly regulated.
بالنسبة لهاي القطعة ما بقدرش أبيعها إلا يكون عليها الرقم هذا. كل المحل موجود عليه أرقام زي هيك، ولازم يعني بالنسبة للمحل لما بدي يجي عندي الزبون لازم أفرجيه يشوف الرخصة إنه قانوني 100%، ولازم أعطيه سيرتيفيكات.
There's a good reason for that, as archaeologist Yuval Peleg knows only too well. Today, he's out in the desert, looking for evidence of a Byzantine monastery which stood on this site 1,500 years ago. It was just one of scores of monasteries built here in a tradition started by monks from Turkey in the 4th century. The idea was to come to be alone with God in these isolated places, far from the temptations of the city. Their legacy is a desert rich in archaeology. So rich that it's impossible to explore everything that's of interest.
יש אלפי אתרים בארץ ישראל, אי אפשר לחפור את כל האתרים מכל מיני סיבות. אחד זה סיבות תקציביות, זה לוקח תקציבים מאוד מאוד גדולים. זה עניין של זמן, גם אם נתחיל לחפור עכשיו את כל האתרים זה לעולם לא ייגמר. וגם אחרי חפירה, גם אם חפרנו משהו, אחר כך צריך לעשות שימור, צריך לשמור על המקום הזה כדי שהוא לא ייהרס.
But the biggest problem archaeologists face is looting. Thieves raid the desert for its ancient treasures, and they seem to have no difficulty in profiting from their booty.
שודדי עתיקות בעצם, הארכיאולוגיה לא מעניינת אותם. המבנה, ההיסטוריה של המבנה לא מעניינת אותם, מה שמעניין אותם זה החפצים שאפשר לקחת ולמכור.
High-profile archaeological finds like the Dead Sea Scrolls have drawn global attention to this desert. Hoping to uncover relics that might be just as valuable, organized gangs come here to dig at night.
החיפוש הוא אחרי המטבעות עם מגלי מתכות או מערות קבורה שיש בהם בדרך כלל ממצאים שהנקברים הונחו ליד הנקברים, מכלי זכוכית וכלי חרס וכלי מתכת ותכשיטים וחרוזים, כל דבר שאפשר למכור אותו בשוק העתיקות ששווה כסף, ולפעמים זה דברים ששווים המון המון כסף.
A single find can fetch as much as $300,000 on the black market. So archaeologists and legitimate dealers find themselves united in trying to stamp out a lucrative trade that's robbing the desert of its antiquities. The archaeology of the desert isn't all to do with Christian sites. This is Matsada, a fortress set on a high peak above the Dead Sea. For many Jews, it's a place of huge significance. According to the first-century historian Josephus, it was the Jewish King Herod the Great who fortified this desert hilltop. 100 years later, a generation after the time of Christ, the Jews rose up against Roman occupation. The revolt failed, but it was here that a group of Jews made a doomed last stand. The Romans laid siege to Matsada. When they finally broke through, Josephus says, they discovered how devoted Jews could be to their faith. Rather than bend the knee to Rome, the defenders, almost 1,000 of them, had committed mass suicide. Matsada draws Jewish visitors from all over the world. The Chernins have traveled from the United States to celebrate a big family occasion, the bat mitzvah of daughter Tori.
We plan to be here for the bat mitzvah because, we live in the States. It's sometimes hard to remember who you are, and trying to teach Tori to remember who she is, which in any religion, in any walk of life, gets harder and harder. There's so much noise that drowns out sometimes in society who you are. The silence is deafening. It's palpable. You can feel what was here, and to be connected to that is magical. You don't get that in many places in the world. The story ultimately is a sad story, but it's not just the ending of the story, it's the redemption, it's the struggle, it's the fight, it's the faith of the Jews that came here to live as Jews.
In celebrating her bat mitzvah, 12-year-old Tori is undergoing a religious rite of passage. It's the age at which Jewish girls are considered old enough to understand God's laws and to be accountable for their own actions. Marking her coming of age here is something Tori will never ever forget.
It's kind of from seeing city life to desert life. I've never seen anything like this. I mean, who gets to come to Israel for their bat mitzvah on top of a really, really, really great mountain? Who gets to just enjoy the sights and the views? Who gets to do that? That makes it special for me. In the desert, it's just so great.
Other tourists come for less elevated reasons. Matsada looks down on the Dead Sea, the lowest point in any landmass on the planet, 425 meters below sea level. River water flows into the sea but can't flow out. It simply evaporates, leaving a salty residue that's built up over the millennia. A third of this water is dissolved salt. It's 6 times saltier than the ocean, and no fish can survive in it. It's dense. Famously, you don't swim here. You float. The healing properties of Dead Sea salt and mud have always drawn visitors to this place. These days, it's a multi-million-dollar business. Some of the world's finest hotels, luxury spa treatments. The mud of the Dead Sea is enriched with minerals essential to healthy skin. It's used to treat psoriasis and eczema, as well as arthritis. Therapy or relaxation, Dead Sea mud packs are famous. Legend has it that one person who came here to use them was Cleopatra. It's good to de-stress, but the bosses of this tourist industry are far from relaxed. Their livelihood depends on the Dead Sea, and the Dead Sea is disappearing. For decades, water from the River Jordan, which feeds it from the north, has been siphoned off for irrigation, factories and homes. Over 1 billion cubic meters of water a year used to flow into the sea. Today, it's less than 100 million. The vital flow has turned into a trickle, and the sea level is dropping fast. These markers have been placed at the shore's edge year by year to keep track of how rapidly the sea is shrinking. Every year, the water depth decreases by as much as a meter. At the same time, new water-intensive industries have appeared, accelerating the Dead Sea's decline. The north of the sea has become separated from the southern end, and dikes have been built across the whole of the southern portion. They've created huge salt evaporation pans, which extract carnallite. The mineral is processed to make potassium chloride, a chemical used in fertilizers, medicine, and food. The raw materials for magnesium metal are also produced here. It all has the effect of reducing water levels even further. And nowhere is this more evident than Ein Gedi Spa, which used to advertise that it was right on the water. But dropping sea levels means it's now almost 2 kilometers away from the shore. If you want to bathe, you have to be driven there. It's exasperating for spa manager Yonatan Elbaz.
עם השנים, חוף הים, הוא היה ממש מגיע עד קצה הכביש, כמו שרואים טיפה יותר דרומה מפה. ממש, איפה שאנחנו עומדים כאן עכשיו, הכל היה מים. אנשים היו יורדים איפה שהדקלים והיו מתרחצים במים. בעצם בשנים האחרונות, ב-20 שנים האחרונות, בגלל מפעלי ים המלח שבדרום, הם שואבים את כל הים והים מצטמק והתייבש כמעט לחלוטין. במשך 20 שנה איבדנו כמעט 2 קילומטר של כביש, של ים, סליחה.
If no action is taken, experts predict that the water level will drop by a further 100 to 150 meters, and many see no end to the process. Yonatan is not alone in fearing that before long, this desert will lose its sea altogether.
אני מאמין שעוד 20-30 שנה כבר לא יישאר לנו ים פה, זה יהיה שלולית אחת קטנה, ומעבר לרמה האישית שלנו, של העסק שלי או בכלל, זה בעיה שהיא לאומית ועולמית, כי אין ים המלח שני בעולם שלנו.
Over millions of years, a natural equilibrium here created a unique desert environment. In a matter of generations, that balance seems to have been completely overturned. What's certainly true is that there's a new and deadly danger on these banks. The drop in sea level has been followed by changes to the groundwater. Along the shore, layers of brine that used to underpin the topsoil have been flushed out. Below the ground, cavities form, then collapse, dramatically and without warning. The gaping depressions are called sinkholes. For decades, geologist Eli Raz has been studying what's happening on land as the water level drops.
כשהגעתי לכאן בשנות ה-70, אז קו החוף היה ממש פה, הים היה פה. לא היה זכר כמובן ולא סימן לבולענים. הבולען הראשון הופיע בסוף שנות ה-80, ואז נוכחנו לדעת שיש עוד בולענים בסביבה, אבל לא היה מדובר על יותר מכמה עשרות. במשך הזמן בולענים התרבו והתרבו, והיום אנחנו מדברים על אלפי בולענים לאורך ים המלח.
Every few days, new holes appear, and each one represents danger. Eli has begun to map them and to try to get a grasp on the precise conditions which cause them. Strangely, Eli came to the desert to get away from life as a geologist. It was idealism which brought him here. In the late 1950s, he joined a kibbutz, an agricultural cooperative.
כמובן שעם הזמן החקלאות התפתחה, והגידול המוביל בחקלאות של נאות מדבר זה התמרים. נאות מדבר ותמר זה הולך ביחד.
The Judean date palm has been cultivated in this desert oasis for thousands of years. Although next to no rain falls here, natural springs provide water for crops and plants. The kibbutz today sees itself as the successor to the biblical settlement of Ein Gedi, famous for its vineyards and palm trees. Eli grew up in a much more fertile part of Israel, but something here spoke to his soul.
המשמעות של המדבר ליהודים היא מאוד מאוד עמוקה. העם היהודי נוצר במדבר. עכשיו, באופן אישי, אני נולדתי לא במדבר, אבל פה אתה רואה את הקשר בין הדברים. וזה באופן אישי, זה הדבר שחשוב לי.
But Eli realized the modern-day mission to replant and restore the date groves was now in peril. Sinkholes were rapidly undermining the cultivated land. So to safeguard the project in which the kibbutz had invested so much, Eli returned to surveying the local geology. And that all but cost him his life. In 2003, he was out alone checking new sinkhole activity. A massive chasm suddenly opened beneath his feet. He came to at the bottom of a hole 9 meters deep.
לגמרי לא. אבל כשקצת התאוששתי, הרגשתי שאני קבור בערימת מפולת, והייתי די בפאניקה, די נפחד. גם היה לי קשה לצאת מערימת המפולת הזאת. ובסופו של דבר, כשישבתי על ראש ערימת המפולת בתחתית הבור, התחלתי לחשוב מה אני עושה. החשש הכי גדול שלי זה שתהיה עוד מפולת, וזה הסוף של הסיפור. ואז מצאתי בכיס שלי גלויה. והחלטתי שאני כותב על הגלויה כמה שאני יכול, נפרד מהאנשים הקרובים אליי.
Soon Eli had written on every inch of the postcard. But it would be another 14 hours before rescue arrived.
אז נזכרתי שיש לי בתרמיל שהייתי חגור בו ונפלתי יחד איתו, יש לי גליל של נייר טואלט. והוצאתי את הגליל הזה וכתבתי עליו כל שעות האור שהיו לי כתבתי עליו.
Back in his office, Eli still keeps private the testament he wrote that day. Special messages to his closest loved ones. For all that he knew at the time, they were his last words to them. But though he's learned caution, nothing keeps him from measuring the environmental damage that's happening here. As a geologist, Eli knows that in this desert of the soul, the landscape shapes material fortunes too. The sinkholes have arrested the economic growth of the whole region. Major tourist attractions like Matsada have escaped lightly, with investment in infrastructure like this cable car system and a gleaming new visitor center. and sections are being repaired on stretches of road which are now too dangerous to drive. But many businesses are struggling, communities are failing, and residents are being driven away by the lack of work. And for Eli, the future of his oasis in the desert is worth so much that he's willing to go on risking his life for it. The Judean desert. Harsh, deceptive, deadly. Here there's nothing soft, nothing easy. This wilderness strips away distraction and pretension. So it's always been a land of deep contemplation, of spiritual yearning. It challenges us to fathom the bedrock of existence. There are those who call it the desert of the soul. But this pilgrim's paradise is also a theater of conflict and struggle. It's a place where people trade on tourism and profiteer from the legacy religion has left here. In the name of progress, this promised land suffers terrible harm. And yet beyond all our shortcomings, the Judean desert still calls on us to look within ourselves to find a better nature and to lift our eyes in search of a better future here on this earth.